Of the wide variety of characters present in fantasy fiction, none are more emblematic of virtue and heroism than paladins. Proverbial knights in shining armor, wielding the strength of their blades and the might of their divinity in the pursuit of their lifelong quest to uphold justice, promote goodness, and smite evil. In this video, I'm going to explore the origins of contemporary fantasy paladins, beginning with a discussion of
what's a paladin?
Right. I should probably lead with that one. Paladins, as they pertain to Dungeons and Dragons and various fantasy video games, are holy knights errant clad in heavy armor, proficient in a wide variety of weapons and shields and capable of utilizing holy magic to both bolster their martial prowess and heal the wounds of their allies. Unlike other character classes within Dungeons and Dragons, paladins are required to uphold the tenets of their knightly code of conduct, and they typically must maintain a morally upstanding character. This emphasis on good behavior makes role-playing a paladin a restricting experience, but a highly rewarding one all the same for players seeking to fulfill an archetypal heroic role, even if doing so makes life for less scrupulous party members more difficult. But where then do these traits originate from? And why are paladins so highly regarded in comparison to other D&D character classes? Though warrior cultures have existed for as long as human societies, and the veneration of heroes has been practiced for at least as long, it is not until the beginning of the Middle Ages that the first traces of modern paladins show themselves within the historic figure of King Arthur. Attested to in early Welsh sources, King Arthur is portrayed first as not a king at all, but rather a warrior and military leader of great skill and bravery. The medieval Welsh poem Michôd, written in the early 7th century by the bard Aneurin, is notable for potentially containing the earliest known reference to the figure of King Arthur. He thrust beyond 300 most bold. He cut down the center and far wing. He proved worthy, leading noble men. He gave from his herd steeds for winter. He brought black crows to a fort's wall, though he was not Arthur. He made his strength a refuge, the front line's bulwark, Gwarther. Should this mention of Arthur refer to the one we know of today, then Michôd would present him as a figure already well known in his time as a paragon of valor and battle. Subsequent mentions of Arthur in the Historia Brittonum, attributed to the Welsh monk Nennius, also describe Arthur not as a king, but as a warrior and military commander who had fought against the Saxons. Then it was that the magnanimous Arthur, with all the kings and military force of Britain, fought against the Saxons. And though there were many more noble than himself, yet he was 12 times chosen their commander, and was as often conqueror. In the Battle of Badon, 940 fell by his hand alone. Arthur's mythological hype would develop even further within Welsh mythology with the poem Pagur of the Black Book of Carmarthen, which tells of his encounters with witches and monstrous dogheads, while adding other fantastical aspects to the lore surrounding Arthur. These high fantasy elements, couched within the early Welsh sources, serve to inspire the 12th century writings of the Welsh Catholic cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, who is largely credited with the popularization of the romantic Arthurian legends we think of today. Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-historical writings would lay the foundation for the Matter of Britain, the body of medieval British literature which encompasses the tales of British legendary kings and heroes, particularly those of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Emulating the early Welsh sources, Geoffrey would inject an element of fantasy into Arthur's story with the addition of the wizard Merlin, and the Christian supremacy present in his writings and his framing of Arthur's battles as holy causes introduced overt religious notions that are emblematic of contemporary D&D paladins. Following the Norman conquest of 1066, French medieval literature would begin to burgeon with the chansons de geste. These poems concerned the legendary materials associated with French history, particularly those involving the Carolingian Emperor Charlemagne and his legendary retainers, the 12 Peers, also referred to as Paladins, wherefrom the name of the character class in D&D is derived. The paladins within the chansons de geste and the latter epics that would emerge from them would be characterized by idealistic chivalrous qualities. The term chivalry itself stems from the Old French chevalerie, which can be translated as horse soldiery. This early definition is explicitly referenced by the Paladin-exclusive Find Steeds spell present in Dungeons and Dragons. As knighthood became an established institution, chevalerie would grow to encompass a broader code of conduct which included the traits and behaviors now associated with the paladins, as well as those of the Knights of the Round Table within the romantic works of medieval French troubadours. Of these chivalric romances, the works of Chrétien de Troyes stand out for their narrative structure and iconic motifs. His romantic poem, Yvain, the Knight of the Lion, tells the tale of a questing knight Yvain, who, in seeking forgiveness from his wife, embarks on an adventure, slaying villainous knights, wicked demons, and a brutish giant with the help of a loyal lion companion, itself a symbol of the chivalric ideals of bravery and nobility. Several of his other works include this questing motif, and their popularity served to characterize Arthur and his knights as pious, honorable warriors embarking on quests and slaying monsters, effectively establishing a prototypical D&D style adventuring party. Additionally, Chrétien de Troyes' works would imbue Arthur and his knights with the chivalrous and heroic qualities which were considered ideals of the age. Their prowess and generosity was emphasized, as well as their respectful treatment towards women and role as defenders of the weak. In addition to their prowess in battle, many of the knights were also skilled healers, a quality inseparable from the Dungeons and Dragons Paladin. Certain knights also had an abundance of a particular quality, with the knight Gawain being the most physically powerful, the knight Galahad being the most devout, and the knight Lancelot having the most riz. The core elements of modern D&D paladins can be found in these three knights, as paladins are pious warriors and noble leaders specializing in strength and charisma. The growing popularity of Arthurian romance and the association of their virtuous qualities to Christianity would influence the depiction of Charlemagne's paladins within medieval French poetry. These poems placed emphasis on their role as defenders of the faith, often representing the paladins as the avatars of Christianity defending Europe from Saracen invasion. The Song of Roland, written sometime between 1050 CE and 1115 CE, recounts the heroic death of the paladin Roland and the majority of his peers at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, where they fought valiantly to the bitter end in the defense of their liege against opposing pagan forces. The Song of Roland would elevate the paladins to legendary status, lamenting their heroic sacrifice and framing them as martyrs of Christendom. The poems and artistic works depicting the dutiful faithful defending their liege at the gap in the Pyrenees Mountains, the metaphorical gateway between the Muslim and Christian worlds, now so named Roland's Breach in honor of the legendary paladin, solidified the archetypal idea of paladins as religious warriors and defenders of the faith. This medieval French framing informs the modern formulation of paladins in D&D, as common amongst all D&D paladins is their ability to use divine magic and their typical requirements of lawful good behavior. It is important to note, of course, that the Christian depictions of knights should not be conflated with the D&D definition of good and/or lawful, nor should the Christian depictions of Saracens be tied to evil and/or chaos. The tales surrounding the legendary paladins were written by Christian people, so it was only natural for the paladins to be characterized as heroes, and for their opponents to be demonized. While the depictions of Roland and his fellows are certainly ideal, focusing on their battle prowess, generosity, and other chivalrous qualities, it's best to stay realistic, and think of these men as just that, men. Ordinary and likely at times cynical soldiers exposed to the horrors of war, where leaders of massive institutions sent wide-eyed young men to their graves. Just like now. Whether they fought for Christianity or Islam, the life of a knight was not enviable, and in pursuing the chivalric codes which often placed death before dishonor, few would live beyond the age of 30. Those knights who did would spend their post-military years carrying scars both physical and mental, living in poverty, and subsisting on the charity of a society that had all but forgotten them. Just like now. It is of no surprise, then, that the Church's promotion of knighthood as a noble duty and saintly calling had an element of self-interest. Promulgating this narrative provided the framing which would inform the ideas and values of later holy wars that European leaders were itching to wage, and the Song of Roland likely served as a major influence in the First Crusade, stoking fervor and zeal in the hearts of Christians across Europe. In campaigning against the Seljuks and Fatimids, the crusaders of this religious conflict, of which certainly no consequences would be felt, captured the city of Jerusalem and established the surrounding Levantine lands as a crusader state. Following the conquest, a group of crusaders formed a religious order to provide support to a hospital founded and dedicated to John the Baptist. Sometime later in the 12th century, the Order of the Knights Hospitaller was founded, making their headquarters within the capital city's walls. The order was tasked with the defending of the Holy Land and the care of the poor, and hospital work became a primary concern. It is in this capacity that another vital role attributed to fantasy paladins is laid bare, that of the combat healer, armed and armored warriors caring for the injuries of wounded fellow soldiers while being just as capable of violence themselves. Modern branches of the original Knights Hospitaller still exist today, engaging in hospital work and contributing to charitable causes, influencing the depiction of D&D paladins who, at least in earlier editions, had to pay a compulsory tithe to charity to maintain their paladin status. During the Italian Renaissance, the Paladins of Charlemagne would reappear in the works of Ludovico Ariosto, who authored his own epic poems pertaining to the adventures of Roland and his fellows. In addition to grounding the work within the real-world struggle between Christians and Muslims, Ariosto also included several fantastical elements, such as ogres, hippogriffs, sea monsters, and, wildly enough, a moon landing. The popularity of Ariosto's works and the operas derived from his writings would solidify the growing association between paladins and fantasy first explored by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and the later poems of Victorian-era authors incorporating Arthurian themes into their works, primarily drawn from Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory, would revive interest in paladins for a modern audience. All of these elements, both historical and fantastical, from the matters of Britain and France and Ariosto, would influence author Poul Anderson in his writing of the 1961 pseudo-historical fantasy novel 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, wherein the protagonist Holger Carlson is transported to a parallel universe by the magic of bullet-induced brain damage. Awakening in the early Middle Ages, with an intrinsic knowledge of horsemanship and archaic French, Holger discovers that he is actively taking part in the songs of heroic deeds which made popular the paladins of Charlemagne's time. Through his quest, he discovers that he is none other than Ogier the Dane, a peer of Roland's and a legendary paladin in his own right. In addition to this pseudo-historical basis, fantasy elements in the style of Geoffrey's and Ariosto's works are present as well, with 3 Hearts and 3 Lions including wizards, pixies, magic swords, and a vicious regenerating troll, to name a few. Anderson's novel, inspired by the Arthurian myths and French poems of the early Middle Ages, would subsequently serve as the primary influence for Gary Gygax in his introduction of paladins, among other things, into Dungeons and Dragons. The Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition Complete Paladins Guide makes explicit reference to Poul Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, which is stated as containing the best model for the paladin class, retelling the story of Ogier the Dane as the protagonist Holger Carlson. Holger's quest for the legendary short sword Cortaine, as well as the other fabled blades of medieval myth, such as King Arthur's Excalibur, Roland's Durandal, or Charlemagne's Joyeuse, served to inspire the iconic D&D sword Karsamir, known to players of more modern editions as the Holy Avenger, a paladin-exclusive weapon which requires of its wielder the same piousness and virtuousness displayed by the paladins of medieval literature. The Complete Paladin's Guide also makes mention of Joan of Arc and El Cid as sources of inspiration for the D&D paladin. The legend of Joan of Arc's divine intervention in the Siege of Orleans, and role as a military leader turned patron saint, is perhaps as on-the-nose as referential material can be when discussing paladins. And the poetry of El Cid, itself influenced by the French chanson de geste, characterized him as a master of the battlefield who found success as a knight-errant, serving both Christian and Muslim rulers. Several other chivalric and Crusada-era elements, historic or otherwise, are present, with both the Paladins of Charlemagne and the Crusades appearing as campaign sourcebooks for advanced Dungeons and Dragons. In AD&D, the prerequisites for qualifying as a Paladin were steep, likely as a result of them being based in the legends of exceptional champions. And note, this was not in the era of point buy or ability score arrays. By rolling 3 6-sided dice in order, a player would have to achieve a minimum strength of 12, a minimum wisdom of 13, and a whopping minimum charisma of 17. I rolled these dice myself for this video to produce an example stat spread, and as you can see, my guy sucks. These requirements were relaxed in subsequent editions, but the stipulation of maintaining lawful good behavior would not be rescinded until as late as the most recent editions of D&D. From 4th edition onward, Paladins were no longer required to maintain a lawful good alignment. Instead, they were required to maintain an alignment which corresponded to their chosen deity, opening players up to exploring non-lawful or non-good characters. As a result of relaxing the alignment prerequisites, evil Paladins were now a playable option, though they were instead referred to as blackguards or anti-Paladins. Serving as twisted reflections of their virtuous counterparts, anti-Paladins embody evil and wickedness while waging their own crusade of darkness against the world. Like Paladins, anti-Paladins also find their roots in medieval poetry, drawing from the Black Knight stock character which finds its origins in Arthurian myth, as well as the character of Mordred, King Arthur's clearly evil-sounding nephew, who betrays and mortally wounds him, and the knight Ganelon, who betrays Charlemagne's army to the Saracens, resulting in the death of Roland and his fellow Paladins at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. Outside of a tabletop setting, Paladins in video gaming are often portrayed in the manner introduced by Gary Gygax in Dungeons and Dragons, who was in turn influenced by Poul Anderson's work, which was itself a pastiche of medieval English and French poetry. The Paladins of World of Warcraft move faster on their horses than any other class, a holdover from their origins within the knightly class of horse soldiers. And Ludovico Ariosto's fantasy elements may have made their way into Final Fantasy IV, wherein the protagonist, the Paladin Cecil, and his party travel to the moon for the final act of the game. The legendary sword of the Paladin Roland, Durandal, appears in Final Fantasy XII, where it is wieldable by the Knight class, a heavily armored, sword-wielding warrior capable of using healing magic, much like the Paladins of Dungeons and Dragons. Paladins also appear in several adaptations of the Warhammer Fantasy universe, as units and hero characters of Bretonnia, a faction which clearly emulates a medieval French aesthetic and is suffused with Arthurian themes. Their elite units are all Paladins, the most virtuous and noble heroes amongst the mortal men of the old world. Really, there are so many depictions of Paladins in fiction, whether it be gaming, literature, or television and film, that it would be difficult to compile them all. Even when not explicitly titled as such, Paladin-like figures have been around in one form or another throughout history, first emerging within early Welsh poetry before gaining popularity in the 12th century matters of Britain and France. Subsequent Romantic poems would develop Arthur's Knights of the Round Table and Charlemagne's Paladins simultaneously, often exploring related themes of piousness and chivalry, and building upon their association with fantasy and adventure. Poul Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lions would serve to influence the implementation of the Paladin character class within Dungeons and Dragons, which to this day serves as the primary reference material for the formulation of a Paladin in a fantasy setting. Considering their longevity throughout history, and their relatively minor evolution as compared to some other figures within the world's folklore, it's likely that Paladins will stick around for years to come. It's safe to say that for any story, if it takes place in a fantasy world, and there's adventure to be had, the Paladin archetype will be present in some form or another doing what they do best. Smiting evil and looking damn good while doing it.